Hello, my name is Helen King and I'm a PhD candidate at Newcastle University. My paper today is entitled Actual Events Movingly Told: The Painful Affects of Child Activism in Beverley Naidoo's Anti-Apartheid Fiction. So this paper is about pain. I'll be talking about pain in children's literature and how it's managed and controlled. I talk about pain as part of the reading experience and as an affect of civil disobedience. I talk about archives as repositories of individual and collective pain. And I talk about how the pain of historical material is mediated in children's fiction. And in my analysis here, I'll be focusing on Beverley Naidoo's Chain of Fire. My argument is that Chain of Fire has a dual commitment to historical accuracy and to mediating its source material in order to communicate pain and hope to its child readers. And in so doing, Chain of Fire offers readers a blueprint for civil disobedience and positions its implied reader as a potential activist. Chain of Fire was published in 1989, and it takes place in the last decade of the apartheid regime, with a fictional account of forced removal. Forced removals began with the Group Areas Act in 1950, and throughout the whole of the apartheid era, numerous acts of law were passed by successive apartheid governments to enforce the separation of the different racial groups. Areas of the country were allocated to certain ethnic groups as homelands, or Bantustans, as they were sometimes known, and whole Black communities were forcibly removed to these areas, which were often void of schools, jobs, fertile land, or easily accessible water. And Cosmas Desmond of the Surplus Peoples Project has described the resettlement policy as the cornerstone of the whole edifice of apartheid. So this policy of forced removal was a large part of the way that apartheid functioned. So in Chain of Fire, our protagonist is 15-year-old Naledi, and her village is about to be forcibly removed. It's about to have its buildings bulldozed and the residents taken to one of these homelands. Naledi, along with some of her school friends, decides to protest this. She leads a protest. Her and her school friends march peacefully to the council buildings in their town, and their civil disobedience is met with a violent police response. The novel ends with the removal of the villagers, but Naledi retains her hope for justice in her country. She's been inspired with a sort of with a collective activist spirit and has been linked up with other activists throughout the novel. And so the novel ends on a note of hope, despite its sad ending for the village itself. At the time of publishing in 1989, forced removals in apartheid South Africa were a present issue. They were happening at that time. But reading it since then and reading it now, it transforms into a historical novel. And this means that while it would have been read as an explicitly anti-apartheid text at the time of publication, it now speaks to broader ideas about what it means for children to resist racism and to resist oppression. Beverley Naidoo herself was born in South Africa. She has spent the majority of her adult life living and working in the UK. Her archive is in Newcastle in the 7 Stories, which is the National Centre for Children's Books in the UK, and has been there since 2016. It contains research for her novels, drafts of her novels, a lot of research for her non-fiction work into anti-racist education and anti-racist literature, as well as a lot of correspondence from editors and publishers, and a large amount of reader responses and some correspondence with readers as well. So as I've said, this paper is concerned with pain in Chain of Fire and its archive. But I would actually like to note my own experiences of reading this archive. Because of the whole of the Naidoo archive, which is considerable, the parts of it pertaining to Chain of Fire are the parts which I personally have found the most painful to read. And this is partly due to the sheer quantity, but also the type of material that is in there. So there are huge amounts of statistics about forced removals and about the experiences of children, of Black children in apartheid South Africa. There are loads of newspaper articles, and I've given you a few examples here. And it feels like there is too much content, too much atrocity, just sheer numbers of people to be able to fit into my research questions and to be able to fit into a novel for children. Yet there's another sort of pain in this reading experience that comes from the individual stories, and these are thrown into sharp relief against the backdrop of these the huge numbers of people removed and who died as a result of forced removals. And these are stories that have haunted me as I've been researching. And I'll return to an example of them at the very end of this paper. So I'm engaging with two linked facets of the way that civil disobedience is represented in Chain of Fire. Firstly, I'm thinking about the way that the novel communicates these events, and the ways that it communicates and mediates pain. And I argue that controlling the source material and controlling how pain is mediated to the reader is really central to this text's vision of child activism. So Chain of Fire, like I said, is first and foremost an anti-apartheid novel written for British readers. And it was written to raise awareness of the atrocities of apartheid among British children. The anti-apartheid ideology of Chain of Fire is linked to the vision of its prequel, Journey to Joburg, which was published 4 years earlier in 1985. Naidoo has written in a statement of origins attached to Journey to Joburg that her intention for Journey to Joburg was to open a window for children in Britain onto an area of South African life which they rarely, if ever, see. In aiming to raise the awareness of the implied reader, this text assumes a link between knowledge and action. And this is an example of what Clémentine Beauvais calls the didactic discourse, which is the didactic discourse is where the adult authority depends on the implied child reader. The implied child reader is trusted with the weighty responsibility of carrying the text's anti-apartheid message into their own life. But beyond this immediate remit, Chain of Fire is an anti-racist text in support of civil disobedience. Pat Pinson argues in her analysis of Naidoo's apartheid fiction that apart from the desirable result of making children familiar with history and the still remaining effects of apartheid, the fact that totalitarian regimes still exist in many places means that children need to be educated about what people can do to each other. This text's broader political scope is evident in a collection of letters from pupils at a New York school in 2009. Clearly asked by a teacher to describe their favourite scene, one pupil writes, "My favourite scene in the book is the scene of the student march. This scene is my favourite because it tells me that if some people think you are a threat, they will try to get rid of you like they did in this book." And so this student is recognising some of the power of civil disobedience that this text communicates. This is a text with an unabashed social responsibility, as Maddie and McCann have described it. It's anti-apartheid, but it's also anti-racist, anti-authoritarian, and pro-civil disobedience. Introduction to a set of proofs to Chain of Fire, which can be found in the 7 Stories archive. There lies the following statement. Although the characters and the village of Bothalong are fictitious, this powerful, movingly told story is based on actual events in South Africa. And this link between actual events movingly told is crucial, I think. The novel broadcasts its commitments to historical accuracy and affective potency. The fact that these events are real means that the reader must be moved if the text is to communicate its message effectively. And it is the fact that they are real that makes the text so moving. I want to look at how Naidoo uses her historical source material, but also at how her mediation of pain to the readers is a key function of this text's vision of activism. The actual events that are referred to in Chain of Fire are both general and specific. In Chain of Fire, Naidoo is drawing on the rich history of youth protests against apartheid, which were often targeting racist education policy, most famously in the Soweto uprising of 1976. Naidoo merges this tradition of civil disobedience with the apartheid policy and practice of forced removals, which I've described earlier. The Surplus People Project, which undertook a huge survey of removed people from 1960 to 1983, estimated conservatively, and there've been other estimates that put this figure at larger. They've estimated that 3.5 million people had been removed, with another 1.9 million at risk of removal. And Naidoo has used this same quote. She's quoted these same figures as the epigraph to Chain of Fire in order to anchor it in this sense of historical accuracy. Naidoo's archive has been ordered by her in some ways, and she's written on a post-it which is affixed to some of her introductory notes when she was fleshing out ideas for Chain of Fire. And she's written here, at time of writing Chain of Fire, I was in exile and reliant on detailed documentation to build up a credible picture of what would happen to a family being removed. And this detailed documentation has been preserved by her and in the archive, in part to bear witness to this commitment to historical accuracy. From the bulk of the material, Naidoo has drawn out a few key places and key people of interest on whom she has modelled the places and people in her novel. And there are a few examples, but I would like to pick out just one here to illustrate my point. So this newspaper article is taken from the Times in 1983, and this article is about the man on the right, the far right in this image, whose name is Saul Mkhize. He was the community leader in a town that was under threat of being forcibly removed. He quite vocally protested this. He was involved in various sorts of resistance to this, and he was shot in the street by police shortly before his town was then removed. And Naidoo has clearly used his story in Chain of Fire to create one of her characters. So if we look at this character of Saul Kobe in the novel, not only does he share a name with this real man, but he also comes out as a community leader during the resistance to the removal in Chain of Fire, and is then shot by police in the public square of the town towards the novel's end. So there's a very clear parallel here. Hazel Rushman, a fellow South African writer, has written in a letter to Naidoo that how moved she was by Chain of Fire, and she says, especially once the protest begins, the story is searing, and you control that painful material without offering slick comfort. It's almost unbearable to know that this is happening to children. So Rushman registers something that I'm trying to get at here, which is that this story's vision of child activism is linked to the communication of pain to the reader. This searing experience of reading, which is almost unbearable, which Rushman describes, is crucial to the text message. However, as Rushman describes, this pain is also controlled. Of all of the detailed documentation that Naidoo collected, some of which I've just described, she carefully chooses only little snippets of it to actually communicate in the novel. The novel communicates the large-scale atrocity of forced removals through one character and her town. And it's through a depiction of Naleidi's inner life that the text links civil disobedience with affects. This quote here is from a conversation that takes place during a conversation that Naledi is having with her school friends when they're thinking early on about what's going to happen to their village and what they should do about it. Naledi felt as if a belt were being tightened and pulled across her chest, trapping her. It was no good just listening to these terrible stories. They had to do something. Her voice rang out without her planning it. We must refuse to go. All of us must refuse. Her emotional pain, Nalady's emotional pain, is experienced in her body as if she's being choked or crushed. And throughout the novel, the implied reader is invited to identify with Nalady, and her response offers a map for civil disobedience, which goes something like this. One hears a story, one feels pain, which is at the point of being physically unbearable, and out of that pain, one speaks and acts. So I've already argued that this text mediates and controls the representation of pain so that it is manageable. And in the same way, Nalady's ability to resist effectively is linked to her ability to control her emotions and control her pain. The peaceful march that Nalady helps to organise, like I've said, is met with a violent police response. She manages to escape, but she sees her friends beaten and dragged into police vans. And after this, she describes feeling desolate and alone, and she's afraid of being arrested herself and afraid of the consequences for her community. And to overcome these overwhelming emotions, she hardens herself. It's described like this: deep inside her, somewhere down in her stomach, Nalady felt a little ball harden, as if it was tying up raw nerve endings. She would have to be hard to get through this thing. So it's her pain that had spurred her to resist in the first place. But in order to maintain this resistance, Nalady must learn to not feel pain, to cultivate a sort of emotional hardness and deadness, to learn not to feel. And this adds another layer to the blueprint for civil disobedience that I think this text offers, which says that in order to act, and to continue to resist, one must be able to control one's own pain, to suppress it to an extent. Nalady remains hopeful in her pursuit of justice, even after her village is removed. And in finishing, I'd like to return to the archive to show how this itself is another example of what Naidoo has chosen to include and exclude from her initial research. These words here are from Maria Zatwana, and this account is one of many oral histories that were collected during the apartheid era and that Naidoo has used in her research. And Maria describes her life in the Bantustan, in the homeland, like this. She says, "No, I don't understand it. I understand nothing. In this place, a child wakes in the morning and he sits and he sits and he looks, and tomorrow he is dead. No, the Lord is gone from this place." And there's a real bleakness and a real horror to these accounts, which doesn't make it into the novel. The novel is, I would argue, it doesn't shy away from the realities of forced removals, but it does endeavour to offer its reader hope. And in lots of these oral histories, one cannot read any sort of hope. The sort of didactic discourse that the novel offers to the implied reader requires this hope. In mediating her painful source material to her child readers, Naidoo must exclude some of the bleakness of that material in order to suggest a more hopeful ending. And in mediating the pain of her source material in this way, Naidoo suggests that civil disobedience involves experiencing pain and then sublimating it into action. And in offering this sort of affect through her novel, Naidoo positions the implied reader of Chain of Fire as a potential activist through their identification with this process. Thank you very much for watching, and I look forward to discussing some of these ideas with some of you later on in the summer.